call it a tale of two Turkish borders. To the south, Syria and Idlib province, where Ankara says it's now directly targeting pro-Assad forces after last week's killing in an airstrike of 34 Turkish soldiers, with Russia backing Damascus in its bid to retake the last rebel-held enclave in Syria. We'll ask just how far it can escalate between now and Thursday's planned trip by Turkey's president to Moscow. And with civilians desperate in Idlib, Turkey bracing for a mass influx of refugees and making it Europe's problem too, by opening its northwest borders with Bulgaria and Greece to exiting migrants and refugees. A justified move? What should the EU be doing as angry locals on the Greek Isle of Lesbos react to again bearing the brunt of new arrivals? It raises the issue, unresolved since 2015, of whether the EU can share the burden and whether it can show the needed solidarity among the 27 to face up to a crisis just like this one. Today in the France 24 debate, Erdogan lays down his rules. And joining us from the Greek Isle of Lesbos, German member of the European Parliament, Eric Marquardt, migration policy spokesperson for the Greens. Thank you for being with us.
Thank you.
From Istanbul, Yusuf Erim, analyst and columnist for broadcaster TRT World. Welcome back to the show.
Thanks.
Mireille Clapeau, member of parliament for Emmanuel Macron's La République En Marche party, who sits on the National Assembly's Foreign Affairs Committee. Welcome back to the show as well.
Hello.
And we're always pleased to welcome retired General Dominique Trinquant, former head of the French military mission to the United Nations. How are you? The France 24 debate on Facebook and Twitter, hashtag F24debate. Yeah, with the opening of that border by Turkey, we've gotten news this Monday of the first fatality, a child dying after being pulled from the sea when a boat capsized off of Lesbos. Athens claimed the boat was escorted by a Turkish vessel. Peter O'Brien has more.
First, some warning shots. Then the Greek Coast Guard tries another tactic to push a dinghy full of people back to Turkey. Since Sunday morning, more than 1,000 migrants have landed on Greek islands. And after Turkey lifted border restrictions on Thursday, more than 10,000 have reached the land borders with Greece and Bulgaria. President Erdogan wants the EU to take on more of a share of refugees.
The number of those who've headed to Europe has reached hundreds of thousands. There will be more. Soon, this number will be in the millions.
Accusing Turkey of deliberately driving migrants across the border, Greece has suspended all asylum applications for a month. Top EU officials will head to Greece on Tuesday.
Turkey is in a difficult situation concerning with regards to the refugees and the migrants. But what we see now cannot be an answer or a solution.
Under a 2016 deal, Turkey's meant to stop the flow of migrants to the EU in exchange for billions of euros. Turkey now hosts some 4 million refugees, most of whom are Syrian, and another million or so is heading there after the latest fighting in Idlib province. President Erdogan says the EU's aid has been slow to come, but Angela Merkel says more than 3 billion euros have been paid out, and she expects Erdogan to uphold the deal.
Yusuf Erim, what's the calculus in opening that border?
Is hopefully the EU will understand that it can't stay silent and stick its head in the sand and act like there's not a problem on its southern border and on Turkey's southern border. Now, we're talking about this right now because supposedly 100,000 migrants are at Greece's door, but 2-3 weeks ago, there's been 1 million migrants at Turkey's door, and I didn't see the EU convene an extraordinary meeting regarding that situation. And we have to remember that even though Turkey is not a member of the EU, it still is Europe's southern border with the Middle East, and it's a very important border that needs to be protected. So the EU needs to look at Turkey and its situation as a wake-up call to what could possibly happen, and we're seeing this now. This is no surprise. Erdogan's been talking about this for 3 or 4 years. When the migrant deal was signed, there was a lot of promises made to Turkey: 6 billion euros, So far, only half of that has been delivered. Visa-free travel, that still hasn't been realized. Opening of new accession chapters for membership talks, that hasn't been realized. Resettlement of refugees, that hasn't been realized. Upgrade of a customs union, that hasn't been realized. If the EU hasn't kept any of these promises to Turkey, why should Turkey uphold the migrant deal? The EU got a very sweet deal with this migrant deal. Turkey spent over $45 billion out of his pocket. This is not my numbers. This is the United Nations figures. When Turkey signed the EU migrant deal, there was 1.5 million refugees in Turkey. Now there's 3.6 million refugees. So Turkey's done a great service to the EU. It's time for the EU to either deliver on its promises or at least start supporting Turkey's initiatives for a comprehensive solution in Syria, in Idlib, in safe zones in the northeast. Turkey has given the EU a way out. It's given it an off-ramp. The EU decided not to take it, and Erdogan saying, well, this is the consequences.
Mireille Clapeau, has the EU been burying its head in the sand when it comes to Syria? Do you take his point?
I think that, we have to say that it's purely blackmail, because these poor people, these poor refugees from Syria, but also Afghanistan, Iraq, etc., are weaponized by Erdogan. And Erdogan has to remember that he is a partner, he is a neighbor to the European Union, and he shouldn't act like this, because the relation with Turkey and the European Union...
But you heard Yusuf Harim's charge, which is that the EU has not held up its side of the bargain when it comes to that 2016 agreement under which Turkey makes sure that the migrants don't come to Europe.
Yes, but money was promised, and part of the money was given, and we know that for Turkey it was a big effort to deal with all these refugees on its soil, but some of the things were done, but the effort has to be kept in this sense.
All right, and once again, there's been a battle of images between Greece and Turkey this Monday. Lots of finger-pointing. We showed it in that report. Turkish authorities releasing that footage of the Greek Coast Guard firing warning shots and battering away at a dinghy to prevent migrants from crossing. Greek authorities responding in kind.
It's all very simple to anyone with common sense. Greece is being invaded by a foreign country, Turkey, which is intentionally using innocent people. Some of them are criminals, but most of them are innocent. In an effort to destabilize Greece on the one hand and Europe on the other.
Eric Marquardt, is Turkey invading? Are criminals landing on the beaches of Lesbos?
I think at the moment we hear some politicians talking about scenes like civil war, but what I experienced on Lesbos is not a refugee crisis or something. 7 boats landed yesterday, yes, but in the end we have the problem that right-wing protesters are attacking the press, the humanitarian aid workers, but also the refugees. And I think that's a really inhumane situation on the Greek islands at the moment. And I think that the European answer, if we say Mr. Erdogan is using these people, using violence, beating them to the border somehow, that our European answer cannot be an inhumane answer like we saw it in the last days.
An inhumane answer?
Yeah, I would say it's shameful what we see when we look at this video of the Greek Coast Guard, but also I think it's shameful that the police is not protecting press freedom at the moment on the Greek island on Lesbos, that humanitarian aid workers cannot help people in need at the overcrowded refugee camp of Moria. There are more than 20,000 people now. The camp is built for 3,000 people, and it's a matter of time when people are dying there.
Eric Marquardt, we've seen in the past days the locals who've been protesting, and it's turned violent at times against the building of a new detention center. The locals on Lesbos who in the past welcomed the migrants and who now say they've had enough. Your thoughts on it?
Yeah, I think that they are not the locals or something. There are many people who have real concerns about the situation, and I think they're right. The islands were left alone by the European Union in the last years, but there are also some right-wing protesters, and the police is not preventing them from attacking different people, and it's very dangerous at the moment. It's not even possible to leave the hotel at the moment because there are groups of people just beating everyone who looks like he's not from Lesbos, and that is a real crisis at the moment, I would say, because our answer to this challenge must be based on rule of law and human rights, and police is doing nothing at the moment to secure the safety of refugees, NGOs, or also press freedom.
General Tancon, I'd like your reaction to what you just heard from Eric Marquardt in the context of the statement that was made late Sunday by France's President Emmanuel Macron, who expresses his complete solidarity with Greece and Bulgaria and says that the borders need to be protected.
Yes, of course. Let's look at the big picture. We have two cases of immigration crisis. The first one was solved through an agreement between Turkey and EU with a big check given to Turkey. The second one is linked to the crisis in Idlib. And why? Because there was an agreement between Turkey and Russia. And because this agreement is failing, now Mr. Erdogan is turning face to EU. But he has to solve the problem with the Russian and with the Syrian, because this is where the crisis is. And go back to the EU, who has no input in the crisis in Idlib.
But his argument is, I have to brace for a mass influx of new arrivals of refugees from Idlib.
Yeah, but
I can't handle it all.
But why does he have a good influx of migrants? Because he failed with the agreement of Sochi. He signed an agreement with the Russian in Sochi, and he failed in complying with his agreement. And now, because he has a problem, he failed in his agreement on Idlib and the agreement of Sochi. Now he's turning back to EU, who has no hands at all on that. That's why he's going to Moscow in 2 days to discuss back on that. I think it's really blackmail made by Turkey in order to have more money given to the European, because he's not able to solve the problem with the Russian.
All right. Germany says it expects Turkey to uphold the 2016 agreement, whereby the EU, again, pays Ankara to prevent migrants from reaching its territory.
With all understanding and every readiness to talk in order to provide more support, I think it is unacceptable to deal with it at the expense of migrants. Our policy and the policy of the EU-Turkey deal is such as not to do politics at the expense of migrants, but rather find agreements between states to neither bring the migrants into a more difficult situation or make life easier for the traffickers.
Yusuf Arim, your reaction to those comments by Angela Merkel?
Well, frankly, when we look at the comments coming out of the EU, we basically see the EU trying to treat the symptoms, which is migrants at its door, but not trying to cure the cause, the root cause, which is Idlib. They're very silent. They were very silent with what was going on in the northeast when Turkey said, hey, let's build a safe zone here. Let's bring 1 million, 2 million refugees, not just from Turkey, from many other countries. It'll make it more comfortable for all these countries hosting refugees. EU was silent again. They're silent right now as Idlib is slowly collapsing. Well, you know, when you make marriage vows, there's the final word the priest says is speak now or forever hold your peace. It's one of those moments right now for the EU. act now or forever hold your peace. And what we're seeing is the EU's migrant policy basically going bankrupt as we're watching these visuals at the Greek-Turkey border. And the sad part is this is not going to be the end of the situation. If the EU doesn't take action and solve this problem now, it's going to happen in Libya when Tripoli collapses. There's going to be the same scenes unfolding on Italian shores. It's going to happen in the future when another MENA country collapses, any of the North African countries collapse, any of the Middle East countries collapse. This is going to be a problem for decades to come because the MENA region is still very unstable.
Let me bring in Mireille Clapeau on this. Because of where it's located geographically, Europe can't afford, the argument made there by Yousef Harim, to ignore what's going on in Syria, in Libya, and other places.
Maybe we should remind that there was a peace process in Syria, and that Erdogan himself decided to have his own peace process with Iran and with Russia. So now he's realizing...
It's not Turkey that broke the deal by launching this offensive in Idlib province.
He did, because he has an obsession, the obsession of the Kurdish threat, and he sees the terrorists everywhere, and he wanted to attack this part of Syria, but it was a bad solution. And I would like to finish. If he had followed the peace process, he wouldn't need now to ask for help from the NATO members and from the European Union.
Dominique Trinquant?
Yes, just put in perspective, the introduction was very, very interesting from Istanbul, is that the problem is the agreement of Sochi inside Idlib, and the agreement of Sochi is between who? Between Moscow and Ankara. EU has no hand on that. And because Ankara was not able to disarm the jihadist movement inside Idlib, after 2 years of this agreement, now the Syrian, with the help of the Russian, that means with the agreement of the Russian, decided to launch the attack inside Idlib because they were not disarmed. The part of the deal which should have been fulfilled by the Turkish should have been to disarm the jihadists in Idlib, and they failed in doing that. And that's why we're in this crisis. And by pushing, because in fact Turkey is pushing migrants to Bulgaria and to Greece, they are just turning the problem and put another problem in the hand of EU, which have no power to do something in Idlib. It's very nice to say EU should do something in Idlib, but the agreement is between Moscow and Ankara.
All right, we're going to pick up on this point with our panel when we come back. Stay with us. You're watching the France 24 debate. Welcome back, or welcome if you're just joining us. It's the France 24 debate, and we're looking at Recep Tayyip Erdogan and that domino effect between his standoff with Bashar al-Assad in Syria and his decision to open the borders to migrants going towards Greece and Bulgaria. We're talking about it with a German member of the European Parliament, Eric Marquardt, who joins us from the Greek island of Lesbos. He is the migrations policy spokesperson for the Greens in the European Parliament. From Istanbul, Yousef Harim, columnist and analyst for TRT World. Here in the studio, Mireille Clapeau, member of the French Parliament from Emmanuel Macron's La République En Marche party, and who sits on the National Assembly's Foreign Affairs Committee, and retired General Dominique Trinquant, former head of the United Nations mission, the French delegation to the United Nations mission. We were just talking before the break about the consequences of this standoff. Eric Marquardt, let me ask you, on Tuesday, we're expecting to Greece the visit of the new head of the European Council, the new head of the European Commission, and the new president of the European Parliament. Are you going to get a chance to see them?
Hopefully, maybe I will see how long I can stay here. At the moment, there's a big lack of security for everybody who's not based on the island. And I think the problem is now if I will meet them on Tuesday, but what happens until then, it's a really dangerous situation at the moment. And I hope that not so many people will die until then.
Why is it a dangerous situation?
And because we have right-wing protesters making checkpoints on different streets on the islands, beating people up. I heard that there are some right-wing protesters heading to the Camp Moria, attacking people there. That's basically a complete disaster, also from a political perspective, because the police is not able or not willing to help people in need, refugees, press who is present on the island. And I think that is actually the situation Erdogan wanted us to show.
And what would you tell David Sassoli, the president of the European Parliament, if you do see him on Tuesday?
I think it's, of course, time to act now. I miss voices who really put a light on rule of law, on human rights. And I also miss some people who are just saying what we can do. I think politics is not about what we cannot do and that we not open the borders here and that we cannot treat people better there. It's about what can we do. And I think the European Union should immediately relocate people from the Lesbos island, for example, but also the other Greek islands to different EU member states. If you want to see who is a refugee, who is a migrant, you have an asylum procedure for that. And I think we have the responsibility now on whole Europe to make this exercise.
Do you agree with the German Chancellor when she tells Turkey not to play politics with the migrants?
Yes, of course, but our answer cannot be to also play politics with the migrants and having borders where people get killed, that it's maybe deterrence or whatever the Prime Minister called it. I think we have all the possibilities to act with a situation based on rule of law, based on human rights. I'm saying this again and again, and that's not what's happening now. So I agree with the sentence of Chancellor Merkel, but I would also expect her to act. It's not about millions who are coming to Europe since 2015. It's about the question what we can do at the moment, and I don't see that there is something else happening than playing some kind of civil war games at the European external border at the moment.
Yeah, at the external borders, Mireille Clapeau, it's been 5 years, as you just heard from Eric Marquardt, since there was that mass influx of refugees back in 2015. The rules of the EU haven't changed much since then. We're still with this Frontex system, the burden sharing when it comes to migrants. The 27 don't agree on them. What can be done on that? Is it mission impossible? Will it be a fundamental weakness of the EU going forward? Exactly. Erdogan is very skilled in using the weaknesses of its partners and adversaries. I think that we shouldn't, at the EU level, we shouldn't show our weaknesses. So we have to be strong, we have to be united. We have a Frontex, we have the border agency, and we should help and show solidarity with Greece and Bulgaria, because even if the humanitarian situation is difficult, but violence shouldn't have its place there. But those far-right groups will, that Eric Marquardt was describing, they'll continue to thrive in places like Greece and Italy if the rest of the EU doesn't share the burden with the migrants that are arriving. Yes, but he mentioned the rule of law, so the state has to be strong and the laws have to be applied. There is a humanitarian right, and violence doesn't have its place neither in the Greek borders or in other states. Are we going to see a repeat of what could be considered kind of an existential crisis for the EU, as we almost did back in 2015?
Yeah, I think that we will certainly have questions will not be resolved. But as you mentioned, Frontex, for example, there is a mobilization currently on Frontex to help Greece. That doesn't mean that this will help to have these migrants coming. We must stay firm in face of the Turkish government. which is playing blackmail with EU, when the problem is his problem with Russia. He needs to solve the problem on Wednesday in Moscow and to solve the problem of Idlib. Europe can't afford, like Turkey, can't afford 4 more million migrants coming. It is not possible. No, I'm not saying that Europe can't feed them. I'm saying that we will have big political problem if we accept 4 more million migrants in Europe.
But does Frontex need a fundamental reform so that it works better?
I think it's working better, but it's not in the core of the problem. It's just helping the border of Greece and Bulgaria, which doesn't solve the problem with Turkey.
Eric Marquardt, you agree?
I think that it would be actually good to have more Frontex officers, more Frontex vessels at the moment at the Greek border, because they could maybe help to given guardianship to the rule of law, human rights. They can protect the NGOs, they can protect journalists, they can also protect refugees here. It is not acceptable that right-wing protesters play anarchy on the Greek island at the moment, and that we just showing pictures of people which Erdogan would award in the end. Yeah, that's like completely the reaction Erdogan wanted us to have on the situation. And I completely would agree that Frontex is needed at the border, but I disagree that Frontex can help preventing migrants from coming. In the end, that's not how the rule of law in Europe works. And I think that we should stay to rule of law, actually.
All right, let's talk about the situation inside of Syria. We were mentioning in part one of our discussion how this is a crisis born of, the forces of Recep Tayyip Erdogan in Syria coming up against those of Bashar al-Assad on their Russian-backed offensive. Syrian government forces this Monday entering parts of the strategic rebel-held town of Sarakeb. That crossroads to the cities of Aleppo and Idlib has already changed hands twice in less than a month. Meanwhile, in the past 24 hours, Turkey claims to have shot down 2 Syrian government jets, killed 19 pro-Damascus soldiers, with President Erdogan warning it's just the beginning.
For now, Turkey hasn't directly targeted Russia or Iran in Syria. We only eliminate the regime elements who spill the blood of our soldiers.
There seems to be, Yusuf Farim, a bit of a disconnect here, because as we heard in those remarks, Turkey's president giving Vladimir Putin a wide berth. The two are going to be sitting down in Moscow on Thursday. And yet it's Russian air supremacy that allows those pro-Assad forces to make those advances.
Well, definitely. When we look at what's going on in Idlib right now, Russia has air supremacy, but Turkey is the dominant force on the ground. And I think the good general will agree with me that despite how strong you are in the air, in the end, wars are won on the ground, and wars are won by area control and being able to hold somewhere. And we're looking at the regime right now. Their forces are completely decimated. They're completely dependent on Iran-backed militia, on Hezbollah. Turkey is more than capable of taking care of these militia, NATO's second largest army, a professional standing army, more than capable. Yes, at times Russian airstrikes are complicating the situation. It's not as bad as it was in the days before. Turkey is making it more difficult to fly in the air, and Turkey has made very, very important advances right now. So the power is shifting, and I'm expecting the shift in power at the military field to impact the diplomatic table. I am very optimistic about this Putin-Erdogan summit. I expect a very good deal, and this time the deal is going to hold. Turkey's going to leave some of its presence in that area to keep Assad honest and make sure he abides by this ceasefire.
Do you agree, General Trinquant?
No, I don't agree. Just look back at the agreement between Moscow and Ankara about the buffer zone with the Kurds. It was cut by half. It's just a small part with, in comparison with what Mr. Erdogan wanted. So I think that Mr. Putin will never accept a defeat of Assad in this region. What he will accept is the reduction of the zone, a smaller region where M5 will be in the hand of Assad.
That's that main highway.
The main
that runs
highway,
north-south.
exactly. And the rest could be a small part waiting for the time when the people will be disarmed inside the pockets in order for Bashar al-Assad to win the whole battle. Because at the end, for the Russian, what is important is that Bashar al-Assad has the end on all Syria. And that's why I don't think that he will ask, he will really be happy with the fact that the Turkish will defeat Bashar al-Assad. It's not possible. And with the air power you've got in the hand, he's ready, able. It's very funny to see that the Turks currently tell that they have destroyed 2 aircraft, destroyed ground forces Syrian, never talking about the Russian. But at one step, the Russian will be there.
Because we saw it a few years back when there was Turkey shot down a Russian MiG that had crossed into Turkish airspace. Relations got very frosty. Could we have another standoff like that one?
It's possible. Yes, it's possible. I think that this is a tool that Mr. Putin will use, certainly.
What do you use in what way? What do you mean?
Meaning that if he push his air force in front fighting against the Turkish will have to make a very difficult choice, either to destroy Russian aircraft and have a real problem with the Russian, or withdraw and have an agreement with the Russian, another agreement, a second Sochi agreement.
Yusuf Arim.
Can I get a quick word in? Two statements I want to make. First one, the good general is assuming that the operation in the northeast is completed. It's not completed. It's halted right now. Yes, Turkey did not get what it wanted, but that doesn't mean that that operation is done. And I think that operation is going to resume in the future because Turkey's already expressed that it's not happy with the way things are going in the northeast with the YPG presence. That's one. And also, regarding Idlib right now, Turkey will maybe allow for some Russian presence in the air, but if Turkish soldiers are getting struck by Russian Air Force, it's going to retaliate regardless who it is. There is no flags. There is no flags when Turkish soldiers are dying. They might think long and hard, but Turkey will retaliate if it's up against the wall and it has no other choice. It's this. We have to remember, this is Turkey's border. Turkey has escalation dominance when it chooses to. It's refraining right now because it doesn't have a problem with Russia. Its problem is with the Assad regime, and it's trying to compartmentalize and keep Russia out of it. So yes, it's complicating the situation, but that does not necessarily mean that Russia has free reign and can do whatever it wants to Turkish soldiers.
No, I think that, of course, talking about Russia is fine, but you must be clear that why Syria is there is because Russia is backing that. And of course, Turkey can't accept that Turkish soldiers are killed. But I just remind our counterpart that it is not Turkish border, it is Syrian soil.
All right, and we talked in part one of our discussion at length about the EU being drawn into all of this. What about NATO? Because the NATO is now, according to the New York Times, providing intelligence to Turkey in its campaign in Syria.
It's very funny because Turkey is playing on that. On one side, they accept to have air defense system coming from Russia, and But
we heard last week the statements from the NATO Secretary General squarely backing Turkey.
Of course, but when you are talking to countries, it's more difficult. As you know, NATO have no means. The means are national means, either US, French, British, Spanish, but you've got no NATO means. So what is funny is that on one hand, you ask to have air defense from Russia, but when you are in a difficult situation, then you ask NATO to back you. And I think that, of course, NATO will say, okay, we'll help you. But I just remind something. It's only if the border of Turkey is crossed by enemy forces, not when they are in Syria.
But according to the New York Times, they're providing intelligence.
Of course, because they've got to play with the Turks. They want Turkey to stay in NATO.
Mireille Clapeau?
You know,
Maybe we can say that Erdogan has 1 foot inside inside the Russian camp, and 1 foot inside the NATO camp. He likes to play. He thinks he's more clever and that he can play to his advantage. But I think that it is not the real situation. We should remind that Russia has 2 targets being there in Syria. First, it wants absolutely save the regime of Assad, and second, it's like a showroom for their weapons and for their new supremacy. So I don't think on Tuesday when they meet together, on Thursday, that Mr. Putin will really tell Mr. Erdogan, yes, we are here to help you. And finally, maybe the final word should be with the Western camp, with NATO.
Eric Marquardt, do you agree?
Yes, I think that we also we should focus also on foreign policy, and that I just wanted to say that I think it's important that people who are fleeing from Idlib are not stuck there because we don't find an answer, we don't find enough humanitarian aid, and we don't have a humanitarian corridor. So I think that also our focus should be on the people who are fleeing from Idlib at the moment, and I'm a little bit concerned that because of the situation at the Greek-Turkish border, we do not have an eye on the people who are fleeing actually
there's been
from
little
Idlib.
talk about the civilians who in the winter there are sleeping outside at this time. There's been, according to a UN estimate, up to 1 million people who've been displaced by the fighting in Idlib.
Yeah, and in the end, we are somehow scared of these people, but I think that these people have more reasons to be scared at the moment, and I think at least we should also talk about immediate action, providing humanitarian aid. I don't care if it's on the Syrian side, on the Turkish side. I think that we need to help the NGOs there, the international organizations, to provide safety to the people. Maybe we will not find a solution for the war in Syria in the next week, but we must find a solution for the people who are needed there.
Mireille Clapeau, could France be doing more? There is a bit of an electoral calculus, isn't there, because we've heard strong statements from the far right in this country that doesn't want us to get involved in any way with what's happening in Syria. Should France be doing more?
I think the solution is certainly at the level of the European Union and not France alone. I think that certainly money has to be provided to the field, to the NGOs, to Syrian organization, and maybe to help Turkey to deal with the refugees, but certainly at the European level.
Well, I think this is really a clear sign of the failure of EU in the last 10 years in Syria. Was not able to be present, was not able to do something. And when
could they have been?
I mean, too late to talk about that. EU doesn't agree on defense, on nothing. So in this policy, we are too late, and now everybody's asking for European money, and that's it. And to ask for European opening its border and providing help, shelter, job for these people, because EU was absent from the crisis for the 10 last year, or make wrong decision initially, and that's why we are at this position. And so I perfectly understand the position of our German friend who wants to talk about the migrants and the difficulty of these migrants. My job is to talk about the fact that currently we've got a problem between Russia and Turkey, and this is the core of the problem. And we don't have to ask EU always to take its checkbox when there is a problem, because other people are not able to solve the problem.
Yeah, but let me add, because I completely agree with you, and it's also I agree with your position. But in the end, how should the European Union play a role if, for example, 7 boats coming from Turkey bring Europe into a crisis? That's also not a situation where you can take European Union serious if you can bring them into a crisis situation by sending some 100 refugees actually to the Greek islands, and that's also a big sign of weakness, actually.
All right, we have to leave it there, unfortunately. So much more to talk about. Eric Marquardt, I want to thank you for joining us from Lesbos. I want to thank Youssouf Harim for being with us from Istanbul. Mireille Clapeau, General Dominique Trinquant. Stay with us. Media Watch is next.
Thank you.
Let me say hello to James Creedon. Yeah, that video that was given by Turkish authorities still creating a lot of conversation.
That's right. So I suppose the confrontation that we're seeing at the border and in the waters of Greece and Turkey is also online as well. And you could say that it's an information war in some respects, an information conflict. And certainly that video has been used as a sort of a weapon against the Greeks, I think you could say. So the video shows what appears to be the Greek Coast Guard intimidating and sort of frustrating efforts by these refugees to come ashore. In any case, it got a lot of comments. This is a Turkish commentator calling it a disgrace. Others, in reply to that, well, this is our own Ludovic de Vucco saying that it was playing in a loop on Turkish television. Others still saying that with a fair dose of irony, Francois, Greek hospitality, welcome to Greece, and saying shame on Europe. So obviously a video like that is going to elicit comments. It's a very charged piece of imagery. Now, reactions coming from within Greece. Yanis Varoufakis, the former finance minister, with his own left-wing party, is calling for humanity and national dignity, and not militarization, walls, and nationalist hysteria. He made a further comment on Twitter saying that there is a need to resist the militarization of the Greek-Turkish border under a pan-European cloud of xenophobic hysteria. So that's one comment coming from within Greece. Guy Verhofstadt, I suppose coming from a more European perspective, we have to stand by
Head
Greece.
of the Liberals in the Parliament.
Exactly. We have to stand by Greece and fight together Erdogan's blackmail. Europe needs to do this by finally setting up the comprehensive European migration policy we already called for since spring 2015, when, of course, there was the big arrival of, under, I suppose, an amnesty, if you like, Eric Ciotti, of the Les Républicains party here in France. Conservatives, exactly. He's saying that we don't want to repeat the error of 2015 when the borders were opened in a more general way. Of course, it's worth being said that we're in the run-up to local elections here in France, so all comments about migration and borders would be, I think, with that in mind as well, coming from a lot of politicians. This is Margaritas Chinas, a European Commissioner for Migration and indeed of Greek nationality. He spoke about having useful meetings in Berlin on a difficult day. He reiterated the need for European unity to prevail. And again, talk of blackmail from Recep Tayyip Erdogan. The Greeks have had enough of this destruction of Europe, says one commentator. They've lived with this for a decade and it's impacting on their lives. And actually the ire here of this particular commentator is towards evil NGOs. Now, what he's pointing at here is there was actually a lot of negative sentiment towards NGOs who were beefing up their effort to try to manage this spike in migration, in refugees arriving. And so you can see that certainly this is a hot button issue in Greece. Greeks on Lesbos are burning down a UNHCR migrant reception centre. So certainly it has reached crisis point.
Yeah, Clapeau, your reaction to that?
Well, it's terrible images. So we should use Frontex, or we should ask for help, because I understand that for Greek citizens and maybe one day Bulgarian citizens, it's very difficult to cope with this situation. So we have to help them. Maybe United Nations and the High Committee for Refugees should give help and method, because violence in no way should be used against these poor people.
Absolutely. So, but I suppose those confrontations, those tensions coming up on social media as well, an echo of them at least. Worth pointing out as well that there were comments across the board. This from a Turkish perspective. Turkey hosting 3.7 million Syrian refugees and also safeguarding millions of civilians in Idlib and North Syria for years deserves the gratitude of humanity, and juxtaposing what they think is a much stronger and more comprehensive Turkish response to the migrant crisis from in Europe. So as you can see, all of the comments are kind of charged in one way or another. I'll just finish with this. This is a journalist for the Al-An Arabic language TV network saying that covering Turkish-Kurdish issue is sensitive, but actually nothing as sensitive as what she finds the reactions to covering Turkish-Greek tensions, and it appears to elicit a lot of emotion every time.
All right. More sensitive than Turkish-Kurdish relations. Okay. James Creedon, many thanks. I want to thank our panel once again. Thank you for joining us here in the France 24 debate.